Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this important discussion. My name is Michael Fromm, and I'm here tonight wearing two hats. One, as the board chair of the Jewish Council for Public Affairs, JCPA, but also as a proud member of the Jewish community of Reading, Pennsylvania, whose federation proposed and is co-sponsoring tonight's program. The Jewish Federation of Reading is the planning, coordinating, and fundraising arm for the community that raises and allocates funds in support of many vital, local, national, and international Jewish causes. JCPA is the national network of 125 Jewish community councils and 16 national Jewish agencies, and the only body that represents the four denominations of American Judaism. Together, we advocate for a just and pluralistic society, global human rights, and Israel's quest for peace and security. We believe that by giving voice to Jewish values of fairness and justice, we can help make society better for everyone. Our Jewish tradition instills in us a commitment to protecting the vulnerable and welcoming the stranger. Rooted in these values for more than 77 years, JCPA has advocated on behalf of refugees and asylum seekers hoping to build a better life for themselves and their children. Over the past several years, JCPA and its JCRC network have worked to ensure that all people seeking asylum are treated with humanity and dignity. The focus of tonight's discussion is on immigration, with the aim of spotlighting the humanity of those seeking asylum at our southern border and the atrocities they are fleeing. These topics are beautifully depicted in a new documentary by Marcela Artiega, Guardian of Memory, featuring Carlos Spector, both of whom are here with us tonight. This is an extraordinary film, and we're so grateful to host the screening and talkback. It's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's panelists. Moderating the panel is Rabbi David B. Cohen, who has been the spiritual leader of Congregation Sinai in Milwaukee, Wisconsin since 1996, and was named a senior rabbinic fellow of the Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem in 2013. He is also a member of the Reform Movement's Commission on Social Action. In 2019, Rabbi Cohen participated in JCPA's fact-finding mission to the US-Mexico border and has continued to educate and activate his community since his return. Marcela Artiega is the writer, director, and producer of Guardian of Memory. Remembrance, her first featured documentary film, received support from the Rockefeller Foundation and was recognized as the best Mexican film at the Guadalajara International Film Festival and the jury's special award at the Malaga International Film Festival. Carlos Spector is the immigration lawyer featured in Guardian of Memory. Throughout the years, the El Paso native has participated in several civil and immigration rights groups, such as the Texas Latino Jewish Alliance, and co-founder. His work has been honored by many human rights organizations and featured in 2 award-winning Mexican documentaries. Naomi Steinberg is the Vice President of Policy and Advocacy at HIAS. Previously, Naomi was the Director of Refugee Council USA, a coalition dedicated to refugee protection and resettlement. Tammy Gilden is the Associate Director of Policy, Advocacy, and Communications at JCPA, where she handles a diverse portfolio of domestic and international civil and human rights issues. Previously, Tammy served as an aide in US Senator Dianne Feinstein's office. I want to encourage our audience members to put any questions you may have in the chat box at any time during the discussion, and we'll answer them as best we can during the Q&A. And with that, I'll turn it over to David. David, welcome.
Thank you very much, Michael. The Jewish people began with an immigrant family. From Abraham and Sarah's generation on, we have been a people on the move. As migrants, our experience shaped our ethics and values. Towards today's refugees, we feel empathy, for we know the heart of the stranger, having ourselves been stranger in the land of Egypt, among many other lands. Yet our shared history is not always sufficient to move us to action. For me, it took an in-person visit with the JCPA to Nogales, Arizona, and across the border to Nogales, Mexico. We met asylum seekers from Guatemala, Honduras, Cuba, even a few from Russia. Some were fleeing famine, others violence and death threats. Many had lost businesses and property. Others had family members murdered. We met as well with volunteers on both sides of the border who've made it their life's work to bring humanity to an inhumane situation. Brian Stevenson, the founder of the Equal Justice Initiative, said we have to get proximate to suffering in order to understand the nuanced experience of those affected. Being in Nogales did exactly that. It brought me close to the hearts of those suffering and obligated me to act. In a similar way, the powerful documentary, The Guardian of Memory, gives us proximity to the unimaginable hardships faced by those in towns like Guadalupe. It reveals the forces on both sides of the border that erect obstacles, preventing asylum seekers from reaching the relief and justice they seek. It's an honor to join Marcela, Artega, and Carlos Spector, as well as Naomi and Tammy for tonight's conversation. I would remind you to take advantage of Zoom's chat function to share your questions with us throughout the program. And Marcela, we're going to begin with you. Mm-hmm. It is, for anyone who has seen it, I think they'll understand how strikingly beautiful the movie is visually, and yet it addresses a viscerally disturbing reality. Can you tell us a little more about what led you to make the film?
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction. And well, first of all, I want to thank everyone, and I want to thank Larry Ratner and JCPA for organizing this wonderful panel. I am very honored to be sharing the panel with all of you. And I thank everyone in the audience for being here, but especially for being interested in this subject. And about the film, maybe what I can first of all say is that, and this maybe will be, if I say this, it will be easier to understand what I was looking for when I did the film. And that is that this is not a film about violence, the violence that is going on in Mexico, but it is a film about the kindness and hope that still exists in people who have gone through hell. And of course, about Carlos' tireless efforts to help them not to lose their voice, and about memory. So maybe if you have this in mind, that you can understand more of how and why I did this film. It's true that the violence occurring in Mexico is not new, but it has never been approached from the perspective of memory. And but this is not a story about the past. This is my way to do something against the tragedy that is happening now in Mexico. As a Mexican, I am aware of the violence in my country. I read about it in the newspapers, and before doing the film, I read a lot of books, and I could feel the violence in the streets, and I hear about it in the political speeches. But it wasn't until I met Carlos and heard him talking about real people who had suffered this violence, until I heard him talking about authorized crime, that I realized I didn't know anything about what was going on in Mexico. And I realized that everybody talks about the violence occurring in Mexico, but no one wants to hear what is really going on in both sides of the Mexican-American border. Because as you could see in the film, this is not only a Mexican problem, but an American issue as well. So by knowing Mexicans that had to flee from Mexico and are now in exile, one can find a lot of more beyond violence. There is forgiveness, understanding, nostalgia, hope, and there's future. So I discovered the potential and inspiration hidden within their stories. Meeting this community helped me understand the dimension of the tragedy that was going on in Mexico, and I think, unfortunately, it's still going on. And I felt the obligation to act. I couldn't sit back and watch the boat sink. So the only tool I had to fight against violence, to fight against murder and people disappearing, the only tool I have is filmmaking. And I have always explored the subject of memory in my films, which I believe is what makes the film a different film. Because it's true that the violence occurring in Mexico is not new, but it has never been approached from the perspective of memory. And I think memory is a very powerful thing. It's not only looking back, memory is naming everything. Because when you look back, you revisit the history and you have to name everything. So I think that memory is keeping alive history, and that itself, it's a hope. I remember Jorge Reyes, who is the man in the film that spent the night in top of his house counting the stars trying to save his family. He once said to me that if no one talks about, he said, if no one talks about us, everything my murdered family members fought for will have been for nothing. No one will remember. And I will add that no one will know what happened, and no one will be curious in the future. I am convinced that in wartime, memory is a tool of resistance, and that art has its own way of remembering, its own way to fight oblivion. So going through the places of history, that's what I was saying before, going through the places of history from the point of view of art implies going through history again, to revisit it, and even in its most hidden corners, but always from a point of view that has to be capable of transform history into memory. Because what usually happens when you review history, or when you talk about facts that happen, what usually happens is that there's always a risk of closing the files or of archiving them. And once the memory is archived, it's forgotten, because it is considered to have been already solved. So that that's why I didn't want it to happen that we revisit the story and then, oh, it's okay, we heard all that they have to say, and we pass to another thing. That's why I wanted to make the film this way. Because I think that in order to have a future, it's very important to preserve memory, but a memory that is not quiet, or that a memory that has motion, a memory in motion.
The memories that you shared and the stories you shared, Marcela, are indelible and make quite an impression. So I understand that on the basis of what you were setting out to do, it was quite successful. How did audiences react in the United States and Mexico? Were they similar in the reactions? Were they different?
They are different, different and not, because what happened in Mexico is that people say, oh, it's good that you made this film because we didn't know that this was going on. And in the United States is the same on the other side, which is the same but different. In which way? Well, in Mexico is that we didn't know that there were these Mexicans in the United States going through this. We didn't know that it was the state, that it was a systematic violence or pursuing all these people. And in the United States, they didn't know what happened or what it's in beneath all these Mexicans seeking for asylum. And I think that's a very important thing.
Very good. I'm going to turn for a moment now to Carlos. And Carlos, where are you, Carlos?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. I just can't see you. That may just be me. Ah, there you are.
There you go.
So Carlos, you are a mix, an amazing amalgam of different cultures and identities. And I wondered if you could address how being Jewish and Mexican has shaped your journey to this work and your participation in the film.
Well, very, very briefly, because I think it's important to understand my background for this particular purpose. And my father was a Brooklyn Jew of Russian descent who fought in World War II and ended up in Israel in 47 and 48. And after being injured in 48, he comes back home, wants nothing to know about war, comes to the Southwest, gets lost in Mexico, and meets my mother in a village. And he was the Arab in the village because he's dark, and my mother was red-haired and green eyes. He went to go see he saw Humphrey Bogart's treasury in the Sierra Madre. He went looking for gold in Sierra Madre, and he says he finally found gold in my mother. And so I was born from that contradiction and raised with that love, and to have someone hurt a Jew or a Mexican was to hurt my soul and to hurt my mother and hurt my father. And generally there was a displeasure, either from the Jewish community or from the Mexican community for who we were or who we weren't. And so I grew up with a deep sense of understanding human beings, that a good person is a good mensch. And without that, then that person really is not fulfilling their values. When I'm 18, I volunteered during the Vietnam War. I end up going to Germany, and then after being in Germany, I make Aliyah to Israel and Kibbutz and Shmuel in the north. And it was there after going to Ulpan, which was an integration immigrant center, where I met Jews from all over the world, none of which spoke Hebrew. And so really, there was a babel of tower, and I said, well, this is kind of like home. And really that was the first time I felt Jewish when everybody else wasn't. And it was just a very humbling experience and an emotional experience when I finally finished law school and a master's degree in sociology and come back home. I started specializing in immigration law almost from the beginning. I went to law school to be an immigration attorney at the age of 30. I've been a union organizer, many other things. And when I come back home, I'd already represented Central Americans. And the time had come to go back home and to represent Mexicans. And when I get back home several years later, the war on drugs explodes in March of 2008, and we have a massive flow of Mexicans fleeing the violence. And when I start taking Mexican cases, I find out that a solo practitioner has more cases about Mexicans than all the nonprofit groups in Texas combined. Why? Because the nonprofits had bought the analysis of the American government that if there was no massive violence vis-a-vis a civil war, then there was no persecution. And so when I saw that, and I couldn't take all the cases, my wife and I decided to organize Mexican in Exiles, which was a group premised really upon Jewish values, that we would help those who had helped others. We couldn't help just anybody. So we signed a social contract, a nonverbal contract, with these families that had left because they were persecuted for their political opinions and their organizing and criticism of the state of the cartels. And our agreement was that we will help you if you continue doing what you were doing in Mexico here. Do not allow the Mexican state to expel you and to use immigration as an escape valve. So the dual purpose of the organization was to create an organization which created, which saved their lives, brought them some comfort, some papers, work, but also at the same time to give them an outlet to continue fighting for democracy in Mexico or the country that they're from. And that's where we were different from other refugee groups. It just wasn't help, move them on. Most stay in El Paso because of the proximity of the border. And so we wanted to integrate them into an organization where they were compelled emotionally and morally to help the others that came after them. And part of the first things that we did with them is that my daughter was in Hillel in Austin at the time, and we organized a Mexican Seder. And we took them to that Mexican Seder in Austin, and they were blown away, and of course exposed to something. And the Jewish community there were also pleasantly surprised with what they were doing and saying. And as a result of that, it became clear to me that I finally had come home, that myself had found himself in terms of working with Jewish values, with a Mexican soul, defending Mexicans primarily from my mother's hometown, which is one of the phantom towns that was basically subjected to a genocide over the years. And as a result of that, we continued to take cases and to continue to expose them to other struggles. But for me, where it's come full circle, is that struggle really is in my spiritual self as well as in the world and the border, is now taking shape, with me now representing probably the case of my life, which are two Guatemalan Mayan genocide Ichil human rights activists who were a year and a half through the MPP program stuck in Mexico. I bring them over, they're locked up for 6 months, and we finally get them out. And I'm in the process right now, and I've spoken to them and the group that has helped them locally in a coalition sustain the families in Guatemala and themselves here. I'm in the process of taking them to the El Paso Holocaust Museum, to probably one of the only, I think, bilingual Holocaust museums in the country, and to teach them about that because they're fleeing genocide. One of them was actually in one of the camps there in the 80s, and were involved in bringing the generals to trial several years ago, and have now been run out of the country because now they're going after the colonels. So here you have a family seeking asylum being expelled by the support of the U.S. government, of their government and military, who expels them into the arms of a Mexican exile group, which is now supporting them and supporting their struggle. But to me, in terms of doing honor to my father, may he rest in peace, is to really bring it full circle, let them know what the Holocaust was, and let the Jewish community know that they have a role to play in other communities by sharing their hurt, their pain, their story, and most importantly, as Marcela said, their memory. and their memory is exactly as painful and as hopeful as that of the Jewish community. And what I hope is that as a result of this, given the nature and scope of your organization, that I receive help for them to get ideas from this particular network on how to show them what they can do to create a genocide commemoration in the United States, because there isn't one in Guatemala because the Army won't permit it. Of course, this has to do with them getting closer to the Guatemalan communities elsewhere. But I think that this issue of being of mixed marriages, the good rabbi being from a Reform rabbi knows that. Rabbi Leon in El Paso is really one of the first, if only, conservative rabbis or lead the shul who really deals with crypto Jews for New Mexico. And so it's a unique space that brings people together and brings Jews and Mexicans and Latinos together in a very meaningful way.
You know, you spoke about the case of your life that you're sounds like you've just completed now, or in the throes of completing, and you made a very, very poignant point in the movie when you said that the problem in Mexico is that they're not applying the laws, whereas in America they're applying the laws, but the laws themselves are unjust. And to be in a position to be able to challenge those laws and to get the country to be able to examine its own ways and turn back to a more just path is really, dare I say, God's work.
Amen.
We're going to turn now to Naomi, who, Naomi, are you there?
I am. Can you see me?
I can see you. I don't know if anyone else can. I hope so. There you are.
Okay, good.
Great. Naomi, the film and the speakers we've just heard from shortly, and we'll hear more from in the questions and answers, have talked about the asylum process as experienced by individuals and families. It would be very helpful if you could give us a bird's eye view of the current state of the U.S. asylum system, some of the changes that are currently being worked through, and the opportunities that we might yet see with the new administration.
Sure. First of all, I just want to say thank you to JCPA for inviting me to be part of another one of your events. I am really honored to be here and to talk about this issue that's so important to all of us. And for those of you who aren't familiar with HIAS, I do want to explain a little bit about who we are, so you know why it is that I'm talking about these issues. I'm not just a random interloper on the call. So HIAS is a Jewish humanitarian organization that provides vital services to refugees and asylum seekers in 16 countries. We advocate for the rights of forcibly displaced people to rebuild their lives. And specific to this issue, which I think is of particular relevance for you all to hear now, we have 7 offices in Mexico, and we have legal border fellows, attorneys working in Texas and California in coordination with our offices in Mexico, providing legal services and other types of support to asylum seekers. So this really resonates deeply with everyone at HIAS. To answer your question, what is the bird's eye view of the US asylum system right now? The US asylum system is really in flux. What we have all seen, I am sure everybody on this call has seen that over the last 4 years, the US asylum system really went through the ringer, and it is, for all intents and purposes, hanging on by a thread now, but it is still hanging on. And we have hope for what the next 4 years will bring. And I should say, this is not about political party. This is simply about the positions of the Biden administration and what we are coming out of, what Donald Trump and his administration's positions were. But this is not a partisan issue per se. So what we have seen since Joe Biden took office just essentially a month ago is some massive changes and some massive announcements about the US asylum system. A lot has been happening. I'm going to rattle through a lot of the proposed policy changes very quickly in the interest of time, but please know this is not an exhaustive list, and I'm happy to answer questions. So He issued an executive order by I mean President Biden on February 4th that really outlines nicely some of the main goals, including steps for addressing the root causes of migration from the Northern Triangle countries of El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala. With the understanding that the US should be helping to improve the conditions in those countries, not to keep people from exercising their legal right to seek protection here, but so that we can help to reduce the need to do so. Because we understand refugees aren't leaving their homes by choice, they're leaving because they have to. So there's a whole root causes strategy with this administration to identify and prioritize actions to address underlying factors, including corruption and the lack of respect for human rights and labor rights, fighting violence, including crimes at the hand of gangs and trafficking cartels, combating sexual and gender-based violence, some of the main push factors for people fleeing for their lives. The administration also wants to set up in the region, in Central America, in those countries, other ways for people to find safety. So one of those ways is to expand the US refugee resettlement program so people don't have to take the perilous journey to our US southern border so that they can find protection in our country in other ways. So setting up regional processing centers for people who are in need of international protection, including children. And as you know, because of the pandemic, or as some of you might know, the southern border has essentially been shut down. And public health experts and advocates firmly believe that shutting the border down and rapidly expelling people under the name of the pandemic isn't actually adhering to basic public health dictates. And so President Biden wants the Secretaries of Homeland Security and Health and Human Services and the Attorney General and the Director of the Centers for Disease as the CDC to get together and see what needs to be done in order to start processing asylum seekers at the border again. I know I'm throwing a lot at you and I apologize, but there really have been some big changes. Also, President Biden announced the rescission of the Asylum Cooperative Agreements, which is a fancy DC jargony term for agreements with Guatemala and Honduras and El Salvador, which allowed asylum seekers who came to the US border to be forcibly returned back to the region from which they came and forced to seek asylum in one of those countries, which would be laughable were it not so serious. It was laughable in some senses because these are the very countries from which the individuals were fleeing, and these countries have fledgling asylum systems at best. And so it was really sending people back to uncertainty and back to precarious situations. And so we are very pleased to see that that was rescinded. And then one of the biggies, and I heard Carlos mention this in passing, and I think it's worth spending some time on, is the end of the migration protection protocols, also known as Remain in Mexico. And what this program did was it forced asylum seekers to wait in Mexico while their US asylum cases were winding their way through the US immigration courts. This was problematic for many reasons, not the least of which is that our domestic law says that if you come to seek asylum, you can stay in the United States. So this was in total violation of US law. But the practical issue was that it forced over 60,000 asylum seekers to live in incredibly dangerous conditions at the US-Mexico border, making it almost impossible for them to have access to legal counsel, to have basic safety, and especially during the pandemic, the stakes got even higher. So President Biden announced the end of migration protection protocols. No new cases will be added. And as of last week, Friday, we are starting to see in very slow numbers, it was only 25 people last week, being able to present themselves at the border and to be able to enter the United States to start to really have their asylum cases heard. So it is a small step, but it will mean a great deal to the many, many, many people who have been forced to stay in really untenable circumstances. And HIAS is actually part of this process and is recommending individuals who should be prioritized based on their vulnerabilities. So we are really excited to be part of this. Now, very quickly, what can you do? The first thing is, even though the Biden administration is much more sympathetic to asylum seekers and to refugees, they still need oversight. You should make sure that you are speaking to your elected representatives and asking them to provide oversight, push the administration to move expeditiously and to make sure that people who are affected by all of the heinous border policies, not just MPP, have access to safety. We also, for those of you who are on the call who are Jewish clergy, HIAS now has a Jewish clergy letter asking the Biden administration to act with urgency to welcome refugees. We're at well over 1,500 signatories, and we would love to have more. We also have a refugee Shabbat coming up on March 5th and 6th. You should go to our website to learn about that and how you can get involved. And then just very practically, we also are part of a program that allows you to donate some of your frequent flyer miles to help HIAS reunite asylum-seeking clients with their families. We have opportunities for you to contribute to bond funds to release immigrants from detention. And we also have multiple volunteer opportunities for attorneys who are working on pro bono projects with asylum seekers in our offices in Mexico. Some of them, these jobs require you to speak Spanish, but many of them don't. And it's all, of course, being done remotely due to the pandemic. So I will stop there and look forward to any Q&A during the last part of the presentation.
Naomi, thank you so much. There's a lot to learn, and things are changing, God willing, quickly. And I'd like to turn to Tammy at this moment and ask her to kind of pick up on this theme about what we can be doing, and to specifically speak to the role that JCPA has taken on in working towards a compassionate, robust system for redoing asylum process.
Thank you so much for that question, Rabbi Cohen. For those of you who don't know, JCPA is the network hub of the Jewish community relations field, representing over 125 local Jewish community relations councils and 16 national agencies, including the 4 denominations of American Judaism. We are charged by our members with coordinating and building consensus across the Jewish community, actively engaging in American public life, and working in common cause with diverse communities to promote a just and pluralistic American society, Israel's quest for peace and security, and global human rights. So rooted in our Jewish values, for more than 77 years, JCPA has advocated on behalf of refugees and asylum seekers who are really hoping to find safe haven here in the United States. However, as Naomi alluded to, the urgency with which we sought to address asylum issues took on new meaning over the last 4 years. I could go through all that we did to oppose this sort of wholesale dismantling of our immigration system, but we would be here all night. So I'll just focus on our work related to asylum, but I think understanding the backdrop here provides really important context. So a few years into the Trump administration, as advocates, we were already battling alarming increases in immigration detention and a host of new administrative policies, essentially shutting off avenues to asylum. But in 2018, news of the administration's decision to separate families served as a turning point for the general public, Jewish communities included. So in response, JCPA played a leading role in partnership with our agencies in elevating the Jewish voice nationally and leveraging the outpouring of concern to really pressure members of Congress and the administration to take action. One such action we took was to draft a letter co-sponsored by ADL, HIAS, and the RAC, and signed by over 350 Jewish community organizations, urging urging the administration to immediately terminate the policy and begin reuniting families. And this public pressure actually forced former President Trump to scale the practice back, although it did remain in force for the duration of his term. And we continue to fight alongside our immigrant rights partners, for example, successfully blocking attempts by the administration to overturn child health and welfare standards and allow for essentially the indefinite detention of families. In 2018, we also traveled to San Diego and Tijuana as part of a HIAS and ADL Jewish Leadership Border Mission, which became the basis for our own trip to the Arizona-Mexico border region the following year, when we led a 23-person delegation of Jewish leaders from 13 states on a fact-finding mission, which David, you spoke very eloquently about in your opening. During these years, we also organized multiple lobby days for Jewish leaders to advocate with members of Congress on top immigration priorities, including rescinding zero tolerance, ending the use of detention, and reversing the criminalization of migrants and asylum seekers, as well as educational webinars and sessions at our national conferences. Most recently, we passed an emergency resolution on immigration issues raised by the pandemic, where we urge for unauthorized entry and re-entry into the country to be considered a civil offense handled solely by the immigration system, rather than what it is currently, which is a federal crime. This is a change I'm particularly proud of and one that we've been building towards in our education programs for a long time. And our resolutions are particularly important because they represent the consensus view of our members and form the basis of our advocacy work. So while it may not seem like illegal crossing has anything to do with asylum seekers, in contravention to US and international law, as Naomi alluded to, this law, which was originally championed by a virulent white supremacist lawmaker in the 1920s, has often been used as the justification for family separation, as well as the detention and deportation of asylum seekers without due process or even a review of their claim. So this resolution is really enabling us to advocate for bolder reforms that I think I can say will literally save lives. So with that, I know we're short on time, so I hope I've provided an overview of the breadth and depth of our work on this issue. And the nation, as Naomi said, is on the verge of major changes, but JCPA's role here will really remain the same. And that is to say that we will continue with our education, consensus building, and advocacy lifting up the Jewish voice on key issues like asylum. Even when we're not able to secure immediate victories, the work that we have done to change narratives around immigration issues and the foundation for action that we have formed are invaluable and will be key moving forward with this new administration. And I think the incredible turnout that we've gotten today is really a testament to that. Thank you, David.
Much, Tammy. We have a series of questions, and we're going to try to get through as many as we can in the very little time we have left. But Marcela, the first question is for you. A number of people have wondered what it was like filming this movie. How much of the time were you in Guadalupe? Was it dangerous given the authorized violence that so many in the community there were experiencing? Were you at all the object of it or concerned about it?
I wasn't a lot of time in Guadalupe. I didn't spend a lot of time in Guadalupe because all the persons that I interview are in the United States and they can't come back to Mexico. So most of the film was shot in the United States. I was in Guadalupe because I thought I had to go there. I couldn't be doing a film about Guadalupe and all the violence happening in Mexico and not going to the towns. So yes, we went there. I wanted to go by ourselves with the crew, passing, just like if we would. I was pretending that we were invisible, but then I asked Carlos if it was safe to do that. Well, I wanted him to know that we were going to do that, and he said, "You are crazy. That's not an option." So he helped us to have some. The police in Mexico went with us to Guadalupe, but I didn't know what to be more afraid of them or just to go by ourselves to Guadalupe. So
were they aware, Marcela, of the nature of the focus of the film?
No, they were not. We were always saying lies about what we were doing. And making up stories of that we were doing something different. But we got nervous at some point because we're just going to places, very specific places, like the houses of the persons that we were interviewing, and we were afraid that they will know that those places, those houses were from the owners were these specific persons, like the Reyes family, and but apparently they didn't say anything, and they were not nervous, but I think people in town were nervous. They knew that we were doing something strange.
Thank you. Carlos, you in the film, I believe it is you who mentions that At one time, Guadalupe had 25,000 citizens living there, and now it's somewhere between 1,000 and 1,500. And I think some people are wondering what was the government's interest in the Mexican government's interest in creating or allowing or facilitating a situation in which a beautiful town like Guadalupe would be destroyed?
Well, that's an interesting question, and I think the short answer is authorized crime. One of the things that we've learned is that there really isn't an organized crime in Mexico or in Central America per se. For none of these criminal organizational activities can exist without the complicity of the state at the municipal, state, or federal level, or the military. And the reason that the state had an interest in allowing the cartel to function as the principal displacer of the individuals from Guadalupe that went from like 20,000 to 800 people was because of its strategic location for the warehouses, because of its proximity to the border, and because of pipelines coming in from North Texas, and because freeways coming up, and because of maquiladora warehouses being constructed there. And so there was an incentive economically to do that in Guadalupe, but that's happening throughout the country. And that's one of the biggest challenges that we have in doing work in Central America and America, is that when America gives money to the government, because they're not going to give it to organized crime, they got to give it to somebody. So they give it to the state, which does nothing but reinforce this authorized crime model that exists. And I, with a friend of mine, a collaborator with him, we just finished publishing a book called Authorized Crime, and we'll be doing more about revealing more of that in the future.
Rabbi Cohen, I think we just lost your audio.
I keep on turning my mic off. There is a question that has come through, and it is for Carlos. This person says, if I heard correctly during the film, Mr. Spector said that Mexican asylum seekers prevail only 1% of the time. I gather that the success rate was low even before Trump took office, which is true, and lower than the rate of asylum grants from those from El Salvador, Guatemala, or Honduras. Can you explain why is that so? Isn't the evidence of the Mexican government's unwillingness to prevent persecution on the basis of political opinion as strong as it is for other claims of those fleeing other countries? This person thought that the film made a compelling case. Why is it that the Mexican nationals applying for asylum to the United States seem to have much less footing?
Just by way of example, I've studied the Mexican asylum issue over the years, from the 90s to the present. No matter what happens in Mexico, between 3, 4, 5, 6%, maybe 1%, it varies that very little, is granted during that period of time. And it has nothing to do with the country conditions, and it has everything to do with binational relationships and economic interest between both governments, which continues with Biden now, because the entire program that they laid out for Central America doesn't apply to Mexico. And it's the same situation in Mexico. It's a displacement, and the extortions and the crimes which are being controlled by the state, which expel individuals. But for the U.S. to grant asylum of Mexicans is really to insult the Mexican government, because you're verifying that there are human rights violations in Mexico. And the other thing, and this also applies to the Central American model, is that the vast majority, especially on the border, when you study the judges, the vast majority of the judges are ex-immigration agents or trial attorneys who've made a career of deporting individuals, or military individuals, or police backgrounds. And so they have this preconceived notion which is the American model, that unless there's a armed insurrection, there is no country condition which is going to justify giving asylum. And it's really also the ability that the model for asylum, which really comes out of the Holocaust with what constitutes the reason for asylum, was premised upon state persecution either by the communist blacks, the Nazis, or authoritarian government. And when you look at what's happening in Central America and Mexico, it really is the authorized crime, or the criminals who are acting in the absence of a state, not because of the state. And because they can't make a connection, we can't make a connection between the criminality, which is not enough for asylum, to the state. It's denied on grounds that there is no state persecution, it's mere criminality. And they make that distinction even though it's authorized crime.
Yes.
Maybe a mouthful, but that's the answer.
You know, it's a corollary to that, Carlos. When Tammy and I and Melanie were in Nogales, in Mexico, we met refugees who were coming from Venezuela and Cuba, and they had a much more enhanced chance of getting political asylum over the past years because of the political situation between the United States and those countries. So it really does come down often to the binational relations and what are in the interests of the countries involved. A final question, perhaps a final question. We have an echo from you at the moment. Okay, let's see if I move a little bit. Marcela, in an interview, you once referred, let's see if I can find this, somebody asked you about the title of the film, The Guardian of Memory. And you said that for you, the guardian of memory is Carlos. And if you could expand on that for a moment, and then Carlos, afterwards, if you could share with us how it feels, how that feels, and how you wear that mantle. So, Marcela?
Yeah. Yes, I thought that Carlos was the guardian of memory because he was interviewing all these persons, all these families, and he was keeping all their stories, which are their memories and their story. So I thought that this is a huge work and a big thing to do. It's like preserving all those memories for the future and for the present, not only for the future. He's preserving them for them, for their children, their grandchildren, etc. But when I was doing the film, I asked one of the persons that I interviewed what if he thought that Carlos was the guardian of memory, and he said to me that we were all the guardians of memory because he was going to tell us his story, but that we had to tell his story to everyone. So we are the guardians of memory. We all are the guardians of memory.
Thank you. Carlos?
I agree, Rabbi. That's really the answer, is that we all are the guardians of memory. The purpose of Mexicans in exile was to give them a voice to leave their own memories. One of the things that we do in Mexican in Exiles is we're one of the few organizations that encourage people to speak politically when they arrive. It's the opposite of silencing them, is turning victims into social actors. And to that end, if I could take this opportunity, one of the things that we're doing, because Mexico is treated so differently, and we have to do it on the border on a very small scale, but we need people's help, and I'm asking for help, is that when people come fleeing, they don't file claims. And because they don't file claims with the police because of the corruption, they're not creating a record, number one, and they're not holding the Mexican state accountable. So in order to create access And in order to stop this type of migrant flow from Mexico, you have to support the democratic movements in Mexico. And the way to do that for us here on the border with no resources other than ourselves is to create a small organization and to create a model that can be used and criticized. And to that end, I ask people to go to mexinx.org, and there's a way of donating money and or, again, remember, we needed help to make contact with those who do Holocaust remembrance work for the purposes of brainstorming and seeing how we can bring the reality of Jewish history to the present so they don't have to go through it again.
Thank you.
God bless.
One last addendum of a question. Carlos, someone wants to know, you mentioned that half of the people that were interviewed in the film, and Marcela, you can answer this too, were eventually deported back to Mexico. Have you been in touch with them? Do you know what's come, what their situation is?
Yeah, it's been, these have been extremely strong cases with the judges, and I think Naomi would understand this, is that this goes back to who the judges are. The laws changed in '96 where if there's a bunch of small little lies and they're not even material, they can cumulatively say that there's an adverse credibility finding because there were so many contradictions in their testimony which came to nothing. So the judges really do use the procedure to convert the rule of law to the rule by law in order to overcome the substance of the case. Absolutely strong cases, but they were denied on that basis. And we have been in touch with them, and they continue in touch with us, and we continue supporting them, and they're trying to fix their papers other ways. But those have been the type of cases that have led me to quadruple heart bypass.
Oh. I really don't want to end on that note, Carlos. We should all in this day and age be healthy. That's the important thing.
I'm not sure you have a choice.
I want to say a special thank you for everyone who has come tonight to share the conversation. Those who participated by speaking, those who participated by asking questions, the Federation of Reading, Pennsylvania, who in conjunction with the JCPA made this event possible. Guardians of Memory conjures a final thought. The Baal Shem Tov, the founder of Hasidic Judaism in the 18th century, taught Ki baschira sod geula, for in remembering lies redemption. Having taken in the memories that were shared this evening, it's now up to us to propagate those memories widely, to share them with people we know in order to add momentum to Carlos and Marcela's work. If you found tonight's session impactful, we encourage you to share your support by making a donation to the JCPA and Carlos' work with Mexicans in Exile. Links will be provided in a follow-up email to all participants. And if perchance you haven't seen the film yet, this incredible film, or would like to watch it a second time, the link will be active on Vimeo for another week. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a good and healthy evening.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Toda rava, haverim. Laila tov.